Albania, a small country in the Balkans, became the scene of a tragedy orchestrated by one man in the 20th century. Enver Hoxha, a teacher from Gjirokastra, rose to power on a wave of guerrilla warfare, but his rule turned the nation into a prison encased in concrete and fear. His paranoia, born in his youth, became law. His nightmares became ideology. This is the story of how one man, who was afraid of everything, made an entire country afraid, and how she opened her eyes when his shadow disappeared. How to become a coward. Gjirokastra, 1920s. The narrow cobblestone streets of the city rang with the voices of merchants, but Khalil Bey's house was quiet. Young Enver, a skinny teenager with burning eyes, was sitting over books, his fingers nervously plucking at the pages. He dreamed of greatness, but he heard a threat in every rustle outside the window. "The world is full of enemies," he whispered, looking up at the stars. "But I'll outsmart them." Enver Hoxha, born in 1908 in Ottoman Albania, grew up in a world where fear was commonplace. Gjirokastra, a city of stone houses and old traditions, had taught him to be suspicious. His father, a merchant, talked about the plots of the neighbors. His mother whispered about evil spirits. Enver, impressionable and ambitious, absorbed these fears like a sponge. At school, he was diligent but introverted, and his classmates noticed how he flinched at loud noises. "Are you afraid, Enver?" they teased, but he just clenched his teeth, dreaming of a day when no one would dare to laugh. In the 1930s, Paris, where Hoxha went to study, became a revelation and a test for him. The boulevards, the cafes, the arguments about Marx and Lenin lit a spark in him. He listened to the communists. Their words about equality sounded like music, but he saw spies in the crowd of students and mockery in the smiles of the professors. "They want to break me," he thought, returning to the cramped room. Paris gave him ideas, but it reinforced his fear. The world was too big, too dangerous. He returned to Albania in 1936, determined to build his own world, small, manageable, safe. During the Second World War, Hoxha found his calling. The guerrilla struggle against the Italians and Germans gave him a purpose. He, a French teacher, became a commander, and his speeches ignited the fighters. But even in the woods, he suspected traitors. "Someone's snitching," he whispered at night, looking at his sleeping comrades. "I have to be on my guard." His fear masqueraded as vigilance, his suspicions as strategy. By 1944, when the partisans liberated Tirana, Hoxha had become a hero. But he was a cowardly hero. Every triumph was just a new threat to him. The power he seized became his armor. In 1945, standing on a balcony in Tirana, he looked at the cheering crowd and saw not allies, but potential enemies. "They're waiting for my weakness," he thought, clenching his fists. "But I won't give them a chance." His first decrees were harsh: executions of collaborators, purges in the party, strengthening of Sigurimi, the secret police. He talked about defending the revolution, but he was defending himself. Albania, still reeling from the war, became his fortress, where fear of the leader was the law. In Tirana, a peasant named Artan, whose brother disappeared in Sigurimi, was looking at a portrait of Hoxha hanging in the square. "He says he's saving us," Artan whispered to his wife. "But from whom?" His words were drowned out by the noise of the crowd, but there was growing anxiety in his eyes. Hoxha, a man who was afraid of peace, began to build a country where everyone was afraid. From Hoxha's youth, full of fears, grew a leader whose paranoia became the fate of Albania. But his fortress was fragile, and the first cracks appeared when he looked at his allies. Strangers are enemies, friends are even worse. Tirana, 1928. The spring wind blew dust through the narrow streets, but Enver Hoxha's office was as stuffy as a tomb. The dim lamp illuminated his face, distorted with anxiety. On the table was a letter from Josip Broz Tito, the Yugoslav leader, whose signature seemed to Hoxha a mockery. "Brotherly friendship," the lines read, but every word sounded like a threat. Hoxha clutched the letter in his fist, his nails digging into the paper. "Liar," he hissed, throwing the paper into the fireplace. The flame flared up, devouring the ink, but the fear in Hoxha's chest only grew. Enver Hoxha, the man whom Albania called the leader, never trusted smiles. For years ago, When the partisans liberated Tirana from the German occupiers, Yugoslavia was his lifeline. Tito, tall, with eagle eyes and the charisma of a commander, seemed like an ideal ally. In 1945, Yugoslav trucks brought flour, weapons, and even printing presses to Albania for propaganda. The Belgrade advisors taught the Albanian communists how to build socialism, and Haja, standing next to the Yugoslav ambassador on the balcony in Tirana, toasted the eternal union. But even then, anxiety was brewing in his heart. Why are they so generous? He thought, looking at the trucks with Belgrade plates. What do they want in return? By 1948, this anxiety had become an obsession. In Moscow, where Koja attended a meeting of the Cominform, he was told about Tito's heresy. The Yugoslav leader dared to argue with Stalin, demanding independence for his socialism. For Koja, it was not just politics, it was betrayal. Tito wants to devour us, he whispered to himself as he returned to Tirana. He wants to make Albania his colony. That same night, he convened the Politburo in an abandoned mansion on the outskirts of Tirana. The room was dark, with boarded-up windows, and the smell of fear and tobacco permeated the air. Tito is a Trotskyist, Koja declared, his voice trembling like a string. He sold the revolution to the imperialists. Mehmet Shehu, his right-hand man, nodded silently, but there was a spark of doubt in his eyes. Nekmai, Koja's wife, was sitting in a corner, her face impenetrable, but her fingers were nervously tugging at the edge of a handkerchief. The break with Yugoslavia was swift and merciless. Haja ordered the closure of the border, the expulsion of all Yugoslav advisors, and the burning of their books and leaflets. The hunt began in Tirana. Anyone who had ever mentioned Belgrade warmly was dragged to the cellars of Sigurimi. Koja personally reviewed the lists of those arrested, his hand trembling over each name. If they admire Tito, he muttered, they hate me. In the port of Durrës, the Yugoslav ships that had brought aid yesterday were now empty, their crews deported. Albania, exhausted by the war, was left without supplies, but Haja saw this as a triumph. He got rid of the first enemy. But fear followed him like a shadow. Moscow became his new hope. Joseph Stalin, stern and unsurpassed, was more than a leader for Koja, he was a god. In 1949, Koja arrived in the Kremlin, his heart pounding like a schoolboy's before an exam. Stalin shook his hand and said, "Albania is our outpost in the Balkans." Koja repeated these words like a prayer as he returned to Tirana. The USSR sent engineers, tanks, wheat. Koja swore allegiance, called Stalin the father of the revolution. But even in this alliance he was plagued by doubts. What if Moscow finds me weak? He thought, looking at the portrait of the leader. What if they choose another one? Stalin's death in 1953 shattered this fragile peace. Koja learned the news at night when the adjutant burst into his bedroom. "Comrade Stalin is dead," he said, and Koja froze, his face turning white. He locked himself in his office, refusing to even see anything. For 3 days he did not eat, did not sleep, only whispered in the dark. "They killed him. They're coming for me." Stalin's death was not just a loss, it confirmed his worst nightmares. The new leader of the USSR, Nikita Khrushchev, with his reforms and the thaw, seemed to Koja the epitome of betrayal. When Khrushchev denounced Stalin's personality cult at the XX Congress of the CPSU in 1956, Koja took it as a personal blow. "They want to break me," he shouted, his fists clenching the edge of the table. "They want me to become their pawn." By 1961, Albania had severed relations with the USSR. Koja made a speech, calling Khrushchev a revisionist and Washington's lackey. Soviet engineers left Tirana, abandoning unfinished factories and power plants. Albania, small and fragile, was left without the support of a superpower. The people whispered about the famine, but Koja was adamant. "We will not bow to traitors," he declared, standing on the podium, his voice trembling with rage. But there was a fear in his eyes that he couldn't hide. Desperate, Koja turned to China. Mao Zedong, with his ideas of eternal revolution, seemed like the new Stalin. In the 1960s, Beijing became Albania's salvation. Chinese tractors, loans, even propaganda posters filled the void left by Moscow. Koja wrote long letters to Mao, calling him the great helmsman. But every word was laced with anxiety. What if he betrays you too? He thought, looking at the world map, where Albania looked like a tiny dot in a sea of enemies. In 1969, when Nixon visited Beijing, Koja exploded. China has sold out to the imperialists. He shouted at the Politburo meeting, his face contorted with rage. By 1978, Albania had severed ties with China, abandoning its last ally. By that time, Tirana had turned into a ghost town. The streets, which had recently been full of voices, were empty. Foreign radio stations were banned, and foreign books were burned in public squares. The diplomats who had visited Albania in the 1960s had disappeared, and their embassies were boarded up. Koja rarely left his office, but his portraits multiplied everywhere. On the walls of schools, in peasant huts, on rusty fences. He talked about the enemies that surrounded us, but the enemies lived in his head. One day in 1977, he called Mehmet Shiha into his office. "Mehmet, you won't betray me, will you?" "What is it?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Shihu, a seasoned guerrilla fighter, looked at him in disbelief but said nothing. That night, Koja did not sleep, imagining his friend sharpening a knife. Albania has become an island in the heart of Europe. Not a neutral Switzerland, but a prison surrounded by walls out of fear. Koja called it a triumph of independence, but his eyes betrayed the truth. He was afraid of the USA, he was afraid of the USSR, he was afraid of China, he was afraid of Yugoslavia. But most of all, he was afraid that the world would just forget about him. The economy was collapsing, the people were starving, but Koja saw this as proof that he was right. "We're alone against everyone," he whispered, standing in front of the mirror, his reflection looking older than himself. "And we will win." But deep down, he knew that fear could not be defeated. He locked Albania in a cage, but he was the first prisoner. Having isolated Albania from the world, Haja began to build walls inside the country. Walls of concrete, fear and madness. Outdoor concrete prison. Albania, 1973. The valley near Vlora was surrounded by greenery, but its peace was disturbed by the rhythmic clatter of hammers and the creak of carts carrying cement. On the hills among the olive groves, gray mushrooms grew. Concrete bunkers, ugly and uninvited. They stuck out of the ground like scars, their round domes glittering in the sun, like eyes watching everyone. In Tirana, in his office, Enver Hoxha leafed through the engineer's reports, his fingers trembling. "They're coming," he whispered, looking at the map, where Albania seemed like a tiny dot surrounded by enemies. "But we will be ready." Enver Hoxha, the leader of Albania, saw enemies everywhere. The USA, the USSR, Yugoslavia, China, the whole world, in his opinion, dreamed of wiping his country off the face of the earth. By the 1970s, when Albania was left alone, cut off from all allies, this fear reached its peak. Koja did not seek dialogue, did not send scouts, did not strengthen the army. He built bunkers. In 1967, after rumors of a possible invasion, no one knew from whom, he announced a plan that shocked even his closest associates. "We will turn Albania into a fortress," he declared at a Politburo meeting, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and determination. "No enemy will set foot on our land." By 1973, this plan had become a reality. 170,000 bunkers, small, round, impenetrable, began to cover the country like a plague. In the village of Kruja, where the vineyards stretched towards the mountains, the peasant Artin looked at the new bunker that had grown up near his house. He was gray and squat, standing 2 steps away from the porch, blocking out the sun. "For protection," the brigadier said, but Artin didn't believe him. His children Lika and Mira were playing nearby, tapping sticks on concrete, their laughter echoing off the walls. Artin looked at them and his heart sank. Protection from whom? He thought, but did not dare to ask. In Albania, questions were more dangerous than bullets. Bunkers grew everywhere. In fields where peasants bent their backs over wheat, on slopes where goats grazed, at schools where children memorized party slogans, at markets where women sold meager crops. They surrounded government buildings in Tirana, the port in Durrës, and bridges in Shkodër. Some were so close to the houses that the residents brushed their shoulders as they went out into the courtyard. Albania, a country of barely 2 million people, has become the most militarized corner of Europe. But this fortress was fragile. There were not enough weapons, soldiers, or even electricity in the bunkers. They were a symbol, a manifesto of Hodges' paranoia, not a defense. In his office in Tirana, Hodges spent hours studying maps. His eyes, reddened from insomnia, slid along the lines of the boundaries. "They can land here," he muttered, pointing at the coast. "Or here from the north." His nightmares were full of shadows. American paratroopers, Soviet tanks, Yugoslav spies. One day he woke up in a cold sweat, convinced that he had seen the Chinese fleet off Duras. "We have to be ready," he shouted to Nejmiya, his wife, who nodded silently, accustomed to his fears. The engineers who were called upon to build bunkers worked under the fear of Sigurimi. The chief architect, Petro Kalia, was a gray-haired man with tired eyes. He knew that the project was absurd. The bunkers were too small for a real war, their construction drained the treasury, and concrete consumed the resources needed for bread and hospitals. But he was silent. One day in 1974, Koja called him into his office. "Petro," he said, his voice as low as the rumble of thunder, "if even one bunker fails, you will answer with your head." Kala nodded, his hands shaking. He knew that Koja wasn't joking. Construction has become a national religion. The peasants, cut off from the fields, were needing cement. The students collected stones for the foundations. Women whose husbands had gone to construction sites whispered about the concrete plague. In propaganda films played in village clubs, bunkers were called the shield of socialism. But the people saw the truth. They were not shields but shackles. In the village of Butrent, a bunker was built right in the cemetery. Its dome towered over the graves. Even the dead were forced to serve, the old man joked bitterly, but his son hissed, "Hush, Sigurimi hears." Living among bunkers has changed Albania. Children played war, hiding in concrete holes, their laughter mixed with the anxiety of their mothers. Peasants walked around the fortifications, cursing them for the stolen fields. In Tirana, students joked that bunkers were Koja mushrooms, but they did it in whispers. The country was living under a siege that did not exist. No one was coming, neither the Americans nor the Russians nor the Yugoslavs. The world that Hodja had isolated himself from had simply forgotten about Albania. Koja, however, saw the threat in every rustle. In 1975, he personally inspected the bunkers at Saranda. His black car, surrounded by guards, stopped at the coast. Koja, in a gray coat, hunched over for years, strode across the sand, his eyes searching the horizon. "They're over there," he told General Aliu, pointing to the empty sea. "I know." Aliu, a seasoned military man, remained silent, his face set in stone. He saw that the leader was sick, not in body but in mind. But to object was tantamount to death. The bunkers became a mirror of Hodja's soul. Every dome, every meter of concrete is his fear, molded into a mold. He dreamed of a fortress, but he built a prison. Albania, surrounded by its own fortifications, was suffocating. Hunger became commonplace, hospitals were empty, but Koja saw this as a sacrifice for the sake of freedom. "We are invincible," he said at rare performances, his voice trembling. No one would dare. But deep down, he knew that the enemy he was looking for was not far away. He was inside himself. In the village of Kruja, Artin looked at the bunker at his house. His daughter Mira, now 10 years old, chalked a flower on the gray concrete. "It's beautiful," she said, smiling. Artin nodded, but his eyes were empty. He knew that flowers don't grow on concrete. And Albania, shackled by the fear of its leader, stopped growing altogether. The bunkers became the physical walls of Hodja's fear. But his paranoia penetrated deeper, into the minds and hearts of Albanians, where every step became a crime. A step to the left is a joke, a step to the right is jeans. Tirana, 1976. The streets of the city were as gray as ashes. Men in identical black coats, women in dark headscarves, all walked in silence with their eyes downcast. The market, where once the voices of merchants rang, was now silent, broken only by the creaking of carts. Enver Hoxha's portrait towered over the square, his stern gaze following everyone. In the shadow of the portrait, Artis, a student, hid a small radio tuned to the Italian wave in his pocket. His heart was beating like a drum. He knew that for one song, he could be taken away forever. Albania in the 1970s became a country where freedom died not with a loud cry, but with a quiet whisper of fear. Enver Hoxha, the leader whose paranoia strangled the nation, saw a threat in every hint of the outside world. Jeans, Italian music, and anecdote about the party. All this was not just forbidden, but equated to treason. The country turned into a panopticon, where Sigurimi, the secret police, heard every rustle, and the people were afraid to even think. Hoxha, locked in his office, wrote decrees forbidding anything that could remind him of the decaying West or the revisionist East. "Their culture is poison," he whispered to Nejmiya, his wife, his eyes burning with feverish fire. "We have to be clean." The ban started with small things, but soon absorbed everything. In 1972, Hoxha issued a decree banning capitalist fashion. Jeans, bright shirts, even long hair were declared an ideological contagion. In Shkodër, a tailor named Fatmir was arrested for making trousers that looked too much like jeans. His workshop was trashed, and he disappeared into the cellars of Sigurimi. "These are not trousers," the investigator shouted, pointing at the fabric. "This is propaganda of imperialism." Fatmir, trembling, tried to explain that it was just a pop, but his words were drowned in accusations. A week later, his family received a letter, convicted of anti-state activities. No one saw him again. Music was the next victim. The Italian radio, whose waves were heard across the Adriatic, was declared a spy tool. In Durrës, 17-year-old Linda, the daughter of a fisherman, hid an old radio under her mattress to listen to Adriano Celentano's songs. Her brother Ilir caught her doing it one day. "Are you crazy? Stop it," he hissed. "If Sigurimi finds out, we'll all be shot." Linda, with tears in her eyes, turned off the radio, but that night the receiver disappeared. Ilir denounced his sister, fearing for his family. Linda was taken in for questioning. "Who gave you the radio?" The officer shouted, his fist hit the table. "Name the spies." Linda was silent, and she was sent to the camp. Her father, broken, stopped leaving the house. The language is also under control. Italian, Greek, and Serbian words were considered ideological sabotage. In schools, teachers like the elderly Elmira from Vlora were afraid to mention foreign languages, even in history lessons. One day, her student, 12-year-old Besnik, asked, "Why do they sing in Italy but we can't?" Elmira paled. "Don't say that, Besnik," she whispered. "It's dangerous." But Besnik, not understanding, told a joke about Hoxha to classmates. A day later, he was taken out of class. Elmira tried to intercede, but she was fired and her family was placed under surveillance. Jokes like songs have become a deadly crime. Markets, schools, even homes have become arenas of fear. In Tirana, a woman named Valbona was arrested for wearing a red headscarf, too bright, according to the patrol. Her neighbor, fearing denunciation, informed Sigurimi. Valbona spent a month in a cell, where she was forced to write confessions about her connections with Italian agents. She returned home broken, her hair turned gray, and her eyes became empty. "I just wanted to be beautiful," she whispered to her daughter, but she was silent, afraid to answer. Hoxha, sitting in his office, saw salvation in these repressions. He was reading Sigurimi's reports, his fingers trembling with delight and fear. "They want to infect us," he told Mehmet Shah, his colleague. "Genes, the radio, and words are their weapons." Shehu, tired of the leader's paranoia, remained silent, but his gaze grew heavier and heavier. Hoxha did not notice this, absorbed in his fears. He dreamed of a pure people, but he created a gray mass where color, laughter, even thought were treason. In the evenings, Hoxha listened to propaganda anthems, but sometimes, in silence, he imagined Italian melodies that he had heard in his youth in Paris. These memories scared him. "I have to be strong," he whispered, looking at the portrait of Stalin. "I have to protect Albania." But deep down, he knew there was no one to protect her from. The enemy lived in him. In Tirana, Artis, a radio student, was caught. He was interrogated for 3 days, beaten, and the names of the spies were demanded. He was silent, and he was sent to the camp. His mother, standing at an empty house, looked at Hoxha's portrait on the wall. "Why did you do that?" she whispered, but there was no answer. Albania, suffocated by the fear of its leader, remained silent with her. The repression drowned out the voices of the Albanians, but Hodja's fear penetrated even deeper, into his own body and soul, where even doctors and gods became enemies. The enemy in the white coat. Tirana, 1980. Enver Hoxha's office was in semi-darkness. A single lamp cast a wavering light on his face, haggard with age and fear. On the table were medical books stolen from the library, their pages covered with his notes. Hoxha, hunched over, read about the heart, blood vessels and poisons. His fingers trembled as he touched the pulse on his wrist. "They won't know," he whispered, looking at the closed door. "They won't poison me." In Albania, where the leader was afraid even of doctors, his paranoia became the law, and his madness became a religion. Enver Hoxha, the man who held Albania in an iron fist, became a prisoner of his own mind by the end of his life. His fear, born in the streets of Gjirokastra, now saw enemies not only in foreign powers, but also in those who were closest to him. Doctors, priests, even in the mirror. In the 1970s, when his health began to fail, his heart was beating erratically and the nights brought headaches. He did not go to the doctors. "Doctors are spies," he told Nejmia, his wife, his voice trembling with suspicion. "They will put poison in it. They will make a false diagnosis in order to overthrow me." Instead of hospitals, he locked himself in his office, studying medical treatises, prescribing himself herbs and pills that Sigurimi secretly brought from abroad. In 1978, when Hoxha had an attack, chest pain, shortness of breath, he refused a doctor. Instead, he called his adjutant, a young Lek, and ordered boiling water and chamomile to be brought. "It's the heart," Hoxha muttered, swallowing the infusion, his eyes filled with horror. "But I know how to treat it." Lika Pale was silent, afraid to object. The doctor, who had been called in secretly, was waiting in the next room, but Hoxha chased him away, shouting, "You work for the CIA. The pain is gone, but the fear remains." Hoxha began to suspect everyone: the Ministry of Health, pharmacies, even the nurses in the village outpatient clinics. "They want me dead," he whispered, and his words became orders. Albania, already exhausted by isolation, suffered from the decline of medicine. Hospitals, stripped of equipment, stood empty. Doctors, fearing accusations of sabotage, avoided difficult diagnoses. In the village of Butrant, a woman named Fatima lost her son due to appendicitis. The local doctor, trembling with fear, refused to operate without an order from above. "It's not my fault," he whispered as Fatima sobbed at his door. "The chief is watching." People deprived of treatment turned to healers, but even they were afraid to speak out about diseases. Hoxha, a doctor to himself, turned his mania into a national tragedy. Religion became an even greater threat in his eyes. In 1967, Hoxha declared Albania the first atheist state in the world. It wasn't a struggle for science, it was a fear that God would distract people from him. Churches and mosques that had stood in towns and villages for centuries were demolished with fanatical zeal. In Shkodra, the old Imam Hassan tried to save the Quran by hiding it under the floorboards of the mosque. When the bulldozers arrived, he was standing in front of the building, holding a book. "This is our soul," he told the soldiers. He was taken to Sigurimi, and no one saw him again. In Kruja, the Catholic church where generations were baptized, turned into a warehouse. The altar was smashed, the icons were burned. The peasants who prayed secretly at night whispered about the curse. "God has forsaken us," they said. But Hoxha is more afraid of him than we are. The destruction of temples was not just a policy. It reflected the inner emptiness of Hoxha. He was not an atheist at heart. He was a man who was afraid of competition. "If they pray to God," he told Mehmet Shah, his colleague, "they will forget me." Shihu, whose patience was wearing thin, remained silent, but his gaze grew darker and darker. Hoxha did not notice this, absorbed in his war with the heavens. In Tirana, where the bells used to ring, now only the party anthems were played. But in the silence of the nights, the peasants lit candles, hiding them from Sigurimi. Vera didn't die. She went underground just like Nadezhda. Stalin's death in 1953 remained an unhealed wound for Hoxha. When he found out about her, the world around him collapsed. He locked himself in his office, refusing to even see anything. His sobs echoed through the corridors, and the servants whispered that the chief had gone mad. "They killed him," he muttered, clutching the portrait of Stalin, his tears dripping onto the frame. "They'll kill me too." For Koja, it was not just the death of a leader. It was a personal tragedy, proof that even gods are vulnerable. He saw Stalin as a father, defender, and ideal, but his departure left Koja alone with his fears. Albania, which had not yet recovered from the break with the USSR, plunged into mourning, but not for Stalin, for a leader whose soul was bursting at the seams. By the 1980s, Koja's mental state had become the religion of the country. His paranoia, his nightmares, his whispers in the void dictated the laws. In Tirana, where portraits of the leader hung on every corner, people spoke in whispers, afraid that their thoughts would be read. In the village of Vlora, Artan, a peasant whose son died without a doctor, looked at an empty mosque and thought, "He is afraid of God, afraid of doctors, afraid of us. But what is he more afraid of?" Artan did not know the answer, but he felt that Koja's fear had infected everyone like a plague. One day in 1981, Koja, weakened and ill, caused trouble. "I know what they want," he said, his voice hoarse. "They're waiting for me to die." Nejmi, tired of his madness, remained silent. She saw how her husband, once a teacher from Jirokastra, became a shadow of himself. "Enver," she finally said, "are you even afraid of me?" He looked at her, his eyes were empty. "Everyone is an enemy," he whispered. "Even myself." Albania, shackled by the fear of its leader, lived in the shadow of his mind. Doctors, gods, even mirrors have become enemies. And in this war, Koja was losing, not realizing that the main enemy was the one who looked at him from the inside. Koja's fear, which destroyed doctors and gods, drove him into a concrete cage, where he was left alone with the shadows of his nightmares. Alone in a concrete paradise. Tirana, 1983. Night enveloped the city, but there was no light in the fortified complex on the outskirts. The concrete walls, cold and gray, muffled the sounds of the outside world. In the center of the complex, in a windowless room, Enver Koja sat at a table, his fingers clutching a pen. He was writing a speech, another tirade against imperialists, revisionists, Trotskyists. His eyes, red-rimmed from insomnia, darted over the lines. "They're all against us," he whispered, his voice trembling in the void. "But I won't let them win." The surveillance camera in the corner was watching him, but it wasn't Haja who was afraid of her. He was afraid of those who were behind her. Enver Haja, the leader of Albania, had become a ghost of his own country by the early 1980s. His face, aged and emaciated, appeared only in portraits hung around Tirana, in squares, in schools, on the walls of dilapidated houses. Public appearances, once his tribune, were now a rarity. The parades where he once stood with his head held high have become a ritual. Koja, wrapped in a coat, waved to the crowd from afar, surrounded by a wall of guards. The people, exhausted by hunger and fear, looked at him without emotion. Albania is frozen in a freeze frame like an old movie where time has stopped. Koja lived in a fortified complex, which he called a residence. It was not a palace but a fortress. Concrete walls, barbed wire, cameras on every corner. His office, modestly furnished, a wooden desk, a portrait of Stalin, a stack of papers, was his last refuge. Here he wrote speeches that no one listened to. "The United States is preparing an invasion," he scribbled, his handwriting uneven. "The USSR sold out to the capitalists. Albanian immigrants are plotting." He denounced everyone, Trotskyists, Social Democrats, even his own ministers. But the world he was so afraid of had long since stopped noticing Albania. Koja, who had locked the country in a cage, did not realize that his screams were drowning in emptiness. His paranoia was at its peak. He was afraid of everyone. The guards who patrolled the complex, the assistants who brought reports, even Nejmia, his wife, whose devotion seemed to him like a mask. One day in 1982, he called his adjutant, young Claudia, and asked, "You're not a spy, are you?" Claudia, who was used to the leader's oddities, nodded, but his heart skipped a beat. Koja looked at him, his eyes searching for betrayal in every move. "Anyone can betray," he said, turning away. "Even you." Claudia walked out, feeling a chill creep up his spine. That evening, Koja ordered the installation of another camera in his office. "It's safer now," he whispered, but his voice was trembling. Nejmi, once his colleague, became a shadow in his life. She saw Enver, the teacher from Jirikastra, turn into an old man consumed by fear. "You should rest," she said one day, her voice soft but tired. Koja shuddered, his hand gripped the edge of the table. "Rest? Stop it," he hissed. "Do you want me to die?" Nejmi fell silent, her eyes filled with pain. She knew that he was afraid not only of enemies, but also of death, which was already knocking at his heart. Haja, obsessed with the idea of dying last, saw every day as a struggle for survival. Albania, cut off from the world, was suffocating. The economy collapsed. Store shelves were empty. Electricity was cut off for hours. Bread was given out on coupons. In the village of Kruja, Artin, a peasant whose daughter Mira once painted flowers on a bunker, looked at Koja's portrait in the village club. "He says he's protecting us," Artin whispered to his wife. "But from whom?" His voice was full of bitterness, but he stopped talking when he noticed his neighbor's shadow. The Sigurimi were everywhere, and even the walls were listening. The people, exhausted by decades of fear, lived in apathy. The streets of Tirana, once noisy, were now empty, their silence broken only by slogans from loudspeakers. "Glory to Comrade Koja." Koja, locked in his complex, did not see this emptiness. His world narrowed down to the walls of his office, where he wrote, slept, and was afraid. His speeches, read out on the radio, sounded like incantations. "We are the fortress of socialism. We will defeat all the enemies." But the enemies only existed in his head. One day in 1984, he looked in the mirror. His reflection was someone else's. Wrinkles, gray hair, eyes full of horror. "They're waiting," he whispered. "They're all waiting." That night, he dreamed of Stalin standing in the shadows. "You are weak, Enver," said the ghost. "You've lost." Koja woke up screaming. His guards rushed into the room, but he chased them away, trembling. Mehmet Shihur, his longtime associate, was the last person Koja trusted, and the last one he suspected. In 1981, Shihur died under mysterious circumstances, officially declared a suicide, but rumors said that Koja ordered his removal, fearing a conspiracy. "Mehmet wanted power," Koja Nekmia whispered, his voice cold. "I saw it in his eyes." Nejmi was silent, realizing that the truth no longer mattered. Koja was left alone, surrounded by shadows that he had created himself. The parades, the last ones in his life, were a farce. In 1983, Koja stood on the podium, his figure seemed tiny under a huge portrait. The crowd, gathered by order, clapped listlessly. He raised his hand, but his gaze was blank. "We are invincible," he said, but his voice was lost in the wind. The people looked at him like an old statue about to collapse. Albania, encased in the concrete of his fears, lived in an eternal freeze frame, but Haja did not see it. He only saw enemies. In his compound, he spent his days rereading old speeches, looking at a map where Albania was surrounded by red arrows drawn by his hand. "They won't win," he whispered, but his voice was getting weaker. "I won't be the first to die." But the death he was so afraid of was already behind him. His heart, worn out by years of paranoia, was beating more and more quietly, and the world he had isolated himself from had long since forgotten his name. In the cruise, Artin was looking at the stars. His daughter Mira was sleeping next to him. "It's going to end someday," he whispered, but he couldn't believe his words. Albania, trapped in its leader's concrete paradise, waited for his fear to let go. But Koja, alone in his fortress, would not let anyone go, not even himself. Haja's loneliness became his last cage, but his death opened the doors of Albania to the world she was so afraid of, the enemy that wasn't there. Tirana, April 1985. In the concrete complex on the outskirts of the city, the silence was thicker than the walls. Enver Koja was lying in a windowless room lit by a dim lamp. His breathing, hoarse and weak, barely broke the gloom. The guards at the door did not dare to move. Nejmi, his wife, was sitting next to him. Her face was stony, but her eyes betrayed fatigue. Haja, whose paranoia had strangled Albania, was dying. His hand, trembling, clutched the edge of the blanket. "They didn't win," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't let them. The last breath was cut off, and the silence became absolute. Enver Hoxha, the man who paralyzed the country with fear, died on April 11, 1985 at the age of 76. His death was not accompanied by fanfare or tears. There were no celebrations in the fortified complex where he had spent the last few years, just cold concrete and the stares of the guards full of confusion. Claude, the young adjutant standing at the door, looked at the body of the leader, and his heart sank. He was afraid of everything, Claude thought, but he died alone. Nejmi left the room without saying a word. Her footsteps echoed in the corridors, like a farewell to an era. Albania, encased in concrete bunkers in fear, froze. The news of Hoxha's death spread slowly, as if no one dared to believe it. The radio was silent until the new leader, Ramiz Alia, declared mourning. But there were no sobs in the streets of Tirana. People who were used to living in whispers gathered in groups, their eyes filled with disbelief. Is he dead? A woman in the market whispered, her hands trembling, clutching a basket. Is that true? The men whose faces were frozen with decades of fear were silent, staring at the sky. It was blue, clear, and cloudless, in a way they hadn't noticed in years. In the village of Kruja, Artan, a peasant whose daughter Mira grew up among the bunkers, heard the news from a neighbor. He was standing outside his house, where the concrete dome was still blocking out the sun. Dead, he repeated, his voice hoarse. So it's over? Mira, now a young woman, looked at her father. Is it over? What is it? She asked. Or is it just beginning? Artan didn't reply, but his gaze fixed on the horizon. There, beyond the fields, there were no tanks, no spies, no enemies that Hoxha made them fear. The border was empty, as were his threats. Hoxha's death was not just the end of his life. It became a moment of epiphany. The people who lived in the shadow of his paranoia began to remember. In Tirana, Linda, a student who was once arrested for Italian radio, stood at a destroyed mosque. I was afraid to sing, she whispered, her fingers touching the stones. But why? In Shkodër, an old man whose brother disappeared in Sigurimi, for a joke, was looking at the portrait of Hoxha, still hanging in the club. You were the enemy, he said softly. Not the West, not spies. You. His whispered words were the first in decades to be unshackled by fear. Albania, locked in a cage of bunkers, decrees, and denunciations, began to open its eyes. But the epiphany came too late. The economy lay in ruins. Factories stood, fields were empty. Children grew up without schools. Hospitals devoid of doctors were a memorial to Hoxha's paranoia. The temples demolished by his order left a void in the souls. People who were used to being silent didn't know how to speak. We were waiting for the enemy, whispered Fatima, a woman from Butrint who lost her son due to the lack of a doctor. But the enemy was here. One person. In Tirana, the first brave souls took to the streets. They didn't shout, they didn't sing. They just walked, looking up at the sky. A young man, Ilir, whose sister disappeared in the camps, tore the portrait of Hoxha from the fence. That's enough, he said, his voice trembling. That's enough. His friends, afraid of Sigurimi, looked on anxiously, but no one stopped him. The portrait fell into the dust, and the wind blew it away like an old lie. The Sigurimi, deprived of their leader, were at a loss. Their shadow, which had been strangling the country for decades, began to melt. Ramiz Alia, the new leader, promised to continue Hoxha's work, but his words sounded empty. For the first time in half a century, people started asking questions. Why were there bunkers? They asked at the cruise. Why were we silent? The answer was simple and bitter. One man, whose fear became law, made the nation afraid of ghosts. Hoxha, a teacher from Jirikastra who became a tyrant, built a world where the enemy was everywhere and nowhere. His death destroyed this world, but it left scars. In the fortified complex where Hoxha died, guards were removing his belongings. Claude, the adjutant, found an old map dotted with red arrows, the invasions that Hoxha had been waiting for. He's seen them all his life, Claude thought, burning the paper. But they weren't there. The flame devoured the map, just as it once devoured Tito's letters. Nejmi, standing at the window, looked at the tyrant. Her eyes, full of pain, saw the city that her husband had broken. You've won, Enver, she whispered. But who? Albania, waking up, looked at empty borders. Neither the Americans, nor the Russians, nor the Yugoslavs went. The invasion that Koja was shouting about did not come. It was not going to. The sky above Tirana was blue, and the sea at Durrës was calm. For the first time in decades, the people breathed freely. But freedom was bitter. The country, paralyzed by one man, lost half a century. Koja was dead, but his fear was still in the air, like dust over bunkers. In the World Cup, standing at the house, I looked at the flower that I painted on the bunker as a child. The paint had faded, but the flower was still visible. "We're going to live," she told her father, her voice firm. "Without him." Arton nodded, his eyes filled with hope for the first time in years. Albania, slowly opening its eyes, learned to see a world without enemies. But the scars left by Koja reminded me that the enemy, who was not there, still won, while he was alive. Enver Hoxha died, but Albania carried his burden for a long time. Bunkers rusting in the sun became monuments to his fear. The people who learned to speak, sing, and think faced the devastation they left behind. Ramiz Alia tried to soften the regime, but Koja's shadow hovered over the country until 1991, when communism fell. Albania opened up to the world, but the scars remained. In empty fields, in broken destinies, in the memory of those who lived in his prison. Koja, a cowardly dictator, proved that one man's fear can strangle a nation. But the flower painted by Miura on the bunker was a reminder. Even in concrete, hope can be born.